All good, we can start recording since now? Can we start recording since now? Amazing. Just let us know when you start, okay?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everybody is here. I would especially like to thank our distinguished speakers for contributing their expertise today, and the Open Dialogue Foundation for its long-standing commitment to bringing this issue to the attention of the international community. The fight against money laundering, terrorist financing, and transnational crime depends on trust, cooperation, and effective international instruments. Mechanisms such as the anti-money laundering framework and INTERPOL cooperation are indispensable. Within the OSCE, they are part of our common effort to strengthen security, uphold the rule of law, and combat organized crime. Precisely because these instruments are so valuable, we have a responsibility to ensure that they continue to deserve the confidence we place in them. Precisely because these instruments are international cooperation mechanism rest on two foundations: confidence in the instruments themselves and, above all, mutual trust among participating states. Whenever these mechanisms prove vulnerable to abuse, they not only become less effective, they also risk eroding the most valuable asset we share, trust itself. Every effective system must evolve to address new forms of abuse. When tools designed to protect our societies are manipulated for purposes of political persecution, economic coercion, or transnational repression, the victims are not only the targeted individuals. The credibility of the instruments themselves is also put at risk. More broadly, this reflects one of the defining challenges of our time: how to ensure that information circulating through our institution is reliable, just as we ask the same question about the information circulating in our public debate. The quality of our decisions ultimately depends on the quality of the information on which they are based. Our challenge, therefore, is not to choose between security and fundamental rights. It's to find the right balance between making these instruments stronger against crime while making them more resilient against abuse. I'm confident that today's distinguished panel will help us better understand this challenge and, above all, identify practical ways to strengthen both security and the integrity of international cooperation. Thank you, and I leave the floor to Lyudmila for open dialogue.
Thank you so much, Mauro, and thank you everybody who came for this important hearing, and also for our speakers who join us online on this Independence Day of US as US representatives. Open Dialogue Foundation work on the issue of weaponization of interstate mechanisms since 2013. We will manage to introduce important remedies in case of INTERPOL, protecting refugees, civil society activists targeted by authoritarian regimes. Since that time, not only us as Open Dialogue Foundation, but many other human rights organizations, international actors were repressed through different interstate mechanisms by authoritarian regimes. Why? Because accountability was not set domestically for their human rights violations. And right now, what we try to present is that it's not anymore just human rights concern. It's not anymore just activist or diaspora or opposition politician, journalist targeted with instrument of INTERPOL, or, for example, abuse of anti-money laundering regulation, targeted reputational risk campaigns, and many other tools. It's also actually members and officials of EU member states or NATO officials. And we have with us also members from Baltic countries. We have cases known in Poland, in Czech Republic, targeted by Russia and by weaponized instruments of Interpol and many others. And here we brought with us expertise, an expert who will explain why we speak specifically about transnational financial repression. What is it? Why it's so important to bring this to the table of Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and specifically Parliament Assembly, where parliamentarians gather and collect recommendations, produce recommendations for parliaments of all of these member states. I would like to give the floor first to Jorge Girasati, President of Economic Inclusion Group, to explain what does it mean, transnational financial repression, who is targeted, and what is the instruments authoritarian regimes have, and why it's a threat to national security of Western countries, not just for human rights concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila. Thank you, Mauro, for allowing us to have this session and for leading these reforms. And I want to thank the Italian delegation and the entire OSCE for doing this session, and for the leadership of Ludmila for organizing the first session at the OSCE about this new issue, this increasingly concerning problem that we call transnational financial repression. I hope that this is the beginning of many reforms at the OSCE level and our country levels. So thank you also for joining us, both people online from the US in this extremely important date for the US, and also the people who are here with us today. Before starting and before talking on the subject matter today, I would like to quickly say thank you to the people from different countries, because I'm from Venezuela, and as you may know, we had a horrible 2 earthquakes this past week. Thousands of people died, but many more would have died if it was not because of the assistance of many countries. Countries like Italy, countries like the US, Israel, El Salvador, many countries came to the rescue, and I want to, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you. Because the sad situation is that we live in a country with a state that neither has the capacity nor the willingness to help. So we need a ton of help. So if somebody wants to talk to me about this issue after the session, please, well, I'm very much focused on this issue. So the topic and the subject matter of my talk today is that I want to really explain to you in detail what is this issue that we call transnational financial repression. It is a highly technical issue, so please go ahead and ask me any questions that you may have after my presentation. So the reality is that right now we live in a situation in which our financial systems are being undermined. Countries have to increasingly understand that they need to develop what I call their financial and national security. Second of all, human rights are being undermined in our country because of transnational repression. Increasingly, authoritarian countries and foreign states and their proxies are weaponizing international agreements in order to target not only human rights activists, NGOs, etc., but also policymakers, public officials, business people, and donors. And we need to protect all these communities because on them depends the flourishing of our democracies. So we're here to explain the situation and to propose ways in which we can stop these abuses. So how does this work? The reality is that we live in a system, an international system, that has a series of international cooperation frameworks. For example, we have the anti-money-laundering international framework known as the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. We have international cybersecurity frameworks. We have terrorist financing frameworks, you name it. All of these frameworks and these agreements are done on the assumptions that countries will not weaponize them. They will not use these frameworks, which are extremely important, like combating terrorist financing, to actually achieve geopolitical gains and to weaponize the system of other countries. That trust-based approach, which was enhanced and strengthened after 9/11 especially, is now being heavily weaponized by many actors around the world, by many companies around the world. So democracies place trust. They place trust in foreign countries when it comes to several layers of information. We all know about INTERPOL. In INTERPOL, we have this international office in which all countries are able to use to advance their security. But the reality is that INTERPOL is not the only framework being weaponized, because as you know, many people are put in the INTERPOL red notice for political reasons. But the reality is that there are many other frameworks, as I was mentioning: anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, cybersecurity conventions. All of these are being weaponized to first compromise the national financial security of our countries, to second of all, initiate legal attacks against people inside Western democracies. Third, try to do phishing attempts to get into the banking data of many people, and not only banking data, but communication information, internet information, etc. And of course, to debank people, to shut down the bank accounts of human rights organizations, policymakers, entrepreneurs in the West. Besides the red notice, for example, there is two notices that we need to reform. There is something called the purple notice of INTERPOL, and there is something called the silver notice of INTERPOL. Purple notice of INTERPOL is a specific mechanism that countries have to access private information of citizens, of or organizations in other jurisdictions. This is being weaponized too. And silver notice of INTERPOL is a new mechanism being created to freeze assets. This can also be weaponized. It is extremely problematic in an increasing environment of trade wars, of an environment of geopolitical tensions, and in an environment in which increasingly countries are weaponizing the international system. Besides that, there is many countries creating misinformation campaigns with the objective of shut down the banking access of many people in the West. They create misinformation campaigns, labeling people as money launderers or terrorist financiers or cybersecurity hackers. And as a result, many people in the US, in Europe, are losing their access to financial services. They're also not being able to do any business. They're also not able to get any grants. This is the problem. They are basically destroying people economically through these matters. Right now, we live in an era in which our data is the same as our natural resources. Data today is the same as oil was 100 years ago. The data that our citizens provide, the data that our companies provide, have to be protected. We cannot allow foreign governments or their proxies to access our data. So we need to create safeguards against that. To end, these mechanisms of repression are being enabled by two factors. First of all, the fact that there is no due process. A country can initiate legal requests in Europe or in the US without asking for a court decision, without needing a court in our countries mentioning, for example, if somebody is really doing money laundering, or if somebody is really doing terrorist financing, we need to have our institutions making that decision. We cannot allow institutions from other countries, especially countries that have authoritarian tendencies, to do that on our behalf. Our courts, our judicial system had to be the ones in charge. We cannot allow judicial decisions coming from authoritarian countries to be used against our own citizens. Because the reality is that we live in a period of asymmetric compliance, which is a term coined by Dan Rothschild in a conversation we were having a couple of weeks ago. What is asymmetric compliance? If a court in a country like Russia or in any authoritarian country makes a decision about money laundering or terrorist financing, etc., these decisions are followed by our courts, by our banks. Our banks will shut down the account of somebody if that person is labeled as money launderer in an authoritarian country. But that will not happen the other way around. If we ask an authoritarian country to prosecute somebody on the basis of our decisions, they will not do it. If we ask an authoritarian country or a bank in an authoritarian country for a specific information, they will not do it. So this is a problem. To finish, what are the solutions? First of all, the OSCE has to promote a framework that identifies all these states and their proxies. They need to identify all the states that are weaponizing these agreements, these very important agreements, and they need to provide penalties. We cannot have automatic cooperation with these states. We cannot allow these states to activate INTERPOL requests, anti-money-laundering requests, intelligence sharing information on the basis of these treaties if they are violating these treaties. That is extremely important, and I know that Mauro is advancing in this session solutions in that regard. There has to be a non-automatic approval of requests coming from these states. Every single security agreement, anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, INTERPOL, every single one of them has to be accountable for human rights abuses, has to be accountable for financial exclusion issues. We cannot have systems that penalize innocent people with the pretext that we are doing it on behalf of security reasons. It is not for security, it is not good for security, it is not good for human rights. And lastly, there has to be reforms to the International Financial Action Task Force system, because right now there is no human rights considerations in that framework, and because right now there is no financial inclusion consideration in that framework. If you lead the charge on this, you will be doing history. Because the reality right now is that nobody, absolutely nobody, has done reforms to protect their citizens from this increasing problem, which is not a niche issue. It is a problem that is affecting many people in many different domains, and especially the people that work in human rights and in policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. And now we're moving for our online speaker. We will give the floor to the President and CEO of Donor Trust, Lawson Bader. Mr. Bader, do you hear us? Can we have?
I do hear you.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and for your
do
patience.
you hear me?
Mr. Baden, you know that philanthropy community is often overlooked in this discussion about weaponization of interstate mechanism. And at the same time, as Open Dialogue Foundation, who work with many charities, we have seen how many donors are affected. And unfortunately, their life and their family members were affected with weaponization of these kind of instruments. As the president of Donor Trust, you work a lot, like entire your experiences, safeguard donors' intent and integrity of charitable funding. We know that there is shortages of donors in the world who support human rights, humanitarian aid. Can you explain what can happen if we don't solve this problem, if it's not addressed? Affection of authoritarian regimes attacking with money laundering labels or terrorist financing labels the cause of donors and specifically philanthropists. What remedies you propose? What is your experience in this regard? Please, floor is yours.
Of course. Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon. And I appreciate the opportunity to address an issue that's very important to me and lies at the heart of what is fundamentally a free and vibrant society, which is philanthropic freedom. And my job here is really to remind us of the larger principles at stake from a donor perspective. You know, as an American, and especially as you've pointed out on this rather important anniversary day, it is meaningful to discuss the relationship between citizens, civil society, and government. And I realize that today's discussion is not about American history, but it is about a principle that transcends any one country, that a free society depends upon citizens remaining free to support the causes and communities that they believe will advance the common good. Now, I lead an organization, as you mentioned, that serves one of the fastest growing segments of American institutional philanthropy, which are called donor-advised funds. And today there are nearly 4 million donor-advised fund accounts in the United States, which have over $330 billion in charitable assets, a figure, by the way, that has doubled just in the last 6 or 7 years. And these accounts distribute approximately $75 billion annually to charitable organizations. So they're not small by any stretch of the imagination. Now, Donors Trust stewards more than $1.5 billion in philanthropic assets, and last year alone, our account holders recommended more than $420 million in grants to organizations both within and outside the United States. And as you said, our mission is simple: to ensure that individuals remain free to support the causes that reflect their values, and if they so choose, to do it anonymously. Now, today is not the mechanics about how that works, but it is about that defining feature that they all share, which is that the donor has the option to make a charitable gift anonymously, whether that gift is $100 or $100 million. And the public need not know who made the gift, and in many cases, the receiving or charity does not know either. Now, that single feature is the principal reason why donor advised funds have grown so dramatically. It protects not only the donor, and also the independence of the charitable sector itself. Now, before I mention why this matters, it's worth remembering that philanthropic freedom is not something that is automatic in society. Like every liberty, it survives only if it is actively defended, which is part of what today's conversation is about. From America's founding came the principle that government is limited, that citizens possess inherent rights, that government exists to protect, not to create. And that philosophy eventually found expression in American law when the United States Supreme Court established the enduring principle that charitable gifts benefiting the public are not gifts to government, and nor do they become government property. And over 100 years later, another landmark decision reinforced that principle when the state of Alabama demanded that a civil rights organization disclose the identities of its supporters as a condition of operating within the state. The Supreme Court rejected that demand, recognizing that compelled disclosure threatened freedom of association and free expression. And that remains an important legal principle today. Now, these examples are American, but the underlying principle is universal. A healthy democracy depends upon citizens both being free to associate, organize, and support the causes they believe advance the common good without unnecessary government intrusion. So, why does donor privacy matter? Well, first, private giving is deeply, deeply rooted in many of the world's major religious traditions. Christians are taught, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And similar principles exist within Judaism and Islam. Charity is intended to reflect humility, compassion, and devotion, not public recognition. And for many believers, compelled disclosure is not merely inconvenient, it is a serious interference with the sincere practice of their faith and a violation of religious freedom. Secondly, donor privacy protects the nonprofit itself. An independent charitable sector functions best when organizations pursue their missions without regard to who funds them. When a charity does not know who recommends a particular grant, it cannot consciously or unconsciously favor that donor or feel obligated to cultivate future gifts. Privacy creates a healthy separation between those who support charitable work and those who actually do the work. Now, in many respects, this independence explains the remarkable growth of organizations like mine. The grant that comes from sponsoring organizations rather than a named account holder allows charities to focus on their mission rather than their benefactors. So greater donor privacy ultimately strengthens a more independent and a resilient civil society. And third, donor privacy protects both the wealthy and the ordinary citizen. The public often imagines philanthropy as the work of large foundations or billionaires. And in reality, much of American charitable giving, comes from millions of individuals making modest gifts. Privacy is valuable to the successful business owner who wishes to shield employees and shareholders from political pressure arising from her personal charitable decisions. And it is equally valuable to the widow in a small town who quietly leaves her life's savings to support a local ministry or community program, or simply wishes to be left in peace. In both cases, charitable giving is a deeply personal act. It is not the government's role or the public's to demand an explanation simply because someone chose to help somebody else. And fourth, donor privacy protects people from real harm, which I know is part of the conversation today. Now, I know this not only as an advocate, but from personal experience. Because of grants made through Donors Trust to organizations that some activists oppose, my family and I have received threats serious enough to frequently have off-duty police officers stationed outside my house, and I have had to have personal security when attending various events. My children and my wife have paid a price simply because others disagreed with the lawful charitable choices of my donors. Now, that experience reinforced a simple truth. When disclosure is used as a tool of intimidation, it is no longer about transparency. It is about discouraging lawful charitable giving by making the personal cost too high. And increasingly, political actors, activists, and segments of the media use donor disclosure as a deliberate strategy to discourage lawful charitable giving by exposing donors to public pressure, economic retaliation, reputational damage, and even physical threats. Now, a widely known example many years ago was Brendan Eich, who became CEO of Mozilla. And after it became public that he had made a lawful 1,000 donation several years earlier in support of a Californian ballot initiative, he lost his position. Now, regardless of one's views on the underlying issue, his charitable giving became the basis for organized political pressure with professional consequences. If organizations like mine are compelled to disclose donor identities, I have little doubt that charitable giving will decline significantly, not because generosity has disappeared, but because many people would reasonably fear the consequences of being publicly identified. History teaches us that governments rarely begin by suppressing speech outright. More often, they make the exercise of freedom more costly. Compelled donor disclosure is one way of raising that cost. And finally, donor privacy matters because it preserves the proper relationship between citizen and the state. There must always be a principal boundary between the citizen and government. Privacy helps preserve that boundary. When governments or those seeking political advantage of some kind can monitor and expose citizens' charitable choices, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, and freedom of expression inevitably become less secure. Now, I would encourage policymakers to ask a simple question when proposals affecting philanthropy come before you. Will this policy make citizens more willing to support the causes they believe in, or less? And if the answer is less, then it is not strengthening civil society, it is weakening it. A flourishing society depends on citizens who are free to devote their time, their talent, and their dollars, or whatever the currency may be, to causes they believe will strengthen their communities. Governments should welcome that freedom, not supervise it. The strength of any democracy is measured not only by the integrity of its public institutions, but also by the independence and vitality of its civil society. When citizens are free to give, free to associate, and free to support the causes they believe in without fear, society itself becomes stronger. The principle to remember is that transparency is the obligation of government, but privacy is the right of all citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Bader. And I would like now to give the floor to Christian Gonzalez-Ruiz, a lawyer and quite known person when we say about defense of victims of red notice abuses, international human rights advisor. Please explain us how it's possible that such important tools like INTERPOL and other interstate mechanisms are weaponized, and especially please focus on the issue of weaponization of INTERPOL by even sanctioned entity and countries like Iran, China, Russia, how it's even possible that they still been under sanctions, able to weaponize such important tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila, Marco, and everyone in this panel. I want to begin by explaining and by retaking a bit about what is actually Interpol. What people imagine Interpol is agents, police with Interpol caps going around and arresting people. Truth is that Interpol works much more as a database or as a data sharing organization. So national police will go to Interpol and ask cooperation by other countries channeled through Interpol. And this is something that happens every day. Think about it. Interpol nowadays has 196 country members. And every day, Interpol databases run around 22 million searches. Now, Jorge has explained a little bit about the notice system, so I want to focus more on how authoritarian regimes abuse the system. And the truth is that in reality, registering a notice in Interpol databases is quite easy. National central bureaus, which are the national police of each member state, can go to Interpol and just plainly simply register either a red notice searching for the extradition and arrest of a person, a blue notice searching for information, a purple notice establishing means of criminality, and these notices will be almost automatically registered in Interpol databases. And they have a very serious consequence. So people get tracked, people get arrested, people get sometimes extradited, people get their accounts frozen, people get a lot of difficulties in practice after being targeted by an Interpol notice. And this happens every day, and sadly, many sanctioned entities are the origin of those abuse of the systems. So together with my practice, we have identified, for example, that Russia keeps on registering notices against individuals, against politicians from the opposition, against business people who has dared to exit the country. And just plain simply, a few months ago, we had a case about a Nordic company who had left the Russian market following the Ukraine invasion, and the Russians just plainly invented what was a priori a commercial dispute and made it into a criminal dispute, including financial crime accusations. And those accusations are so serious, so technical, and so complex that are very difficult to challenge in practice. So what these regimes are using nowadays is this kind of criminality and this kind of registering to make Interpol just plainly accept that their claims are legitimate, and in consequence ask cooperations by third countries. And it's true, Interpol has safeguard mechanisms. Interpol has the CCF, which is the Commission for the Control of Files, in which an individual can go and challenge the registration of a notice, alleging, for example, that the notice is predominantly political or is on breach on the fundamental human rights. But the truth is that this is a posteriori control. So this comes only after the individual has already been, in worst cases, arrested, extradition has been requested, their accounts have been frozen, and the human toll is not coming back after the notice is deleted. Truth is that Interpol and the whole Interpol and international police cooperation needs reform. And this I want to be, in this point I want to be really, really specific, and it's that the Interpol is not the problem per se. Interpol is just the channel through which cooperation is going. The system is based upon trust. International police cooperation is based upon the good faith of all Interpol members. When Interpol members ask or act breaching those good faith obligations, that undermines the system per se. The choices and the opportunities that the system has must not be misused and must not be undermined by authoritarian regimes. And with this, I would like to conclude. We want to be a critical friend of Interpol, defending people that are wrongly caught in this net, and insisting that the organization that is built upon the spirit of human rights needs to actually live on that spirit, and international police cooperation must be kept on good faith. Sanctions must be established for those that abuse the system. And the tools to fix this exist. What is missing is the will, and let us be the one who supply it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And since we have with us member of the parliament from Latvia, Ms. Abrama, you know the situation that Russia was able to weaponize Interpol against several Baltic countries, Czech Republic and also Poland a few years ago. And it's a huge issue. So this is a moment where we had direct evidences when Interpol and many interstate mechanisms moved not only being a weapon against civil society and diaspora opposition, but also used as a weapon against members of the government and parliament and prosecutors. What is perception? How known this issue actually in general? How it's discussed in your society? What we should do? How we can address it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, when I met Ludmila in Vienna and we spoke about this topic, it seemed to me to be completely new. And afterwards, I started to think about some examples. As you mentioned, before that, of course, some countries try to use such weaponized misuse, also use different instruments against politicians, which are against, for example, cooperation with Russia, Belarus, etc. I cannot be so deep in the topic of countering transnational financial repression, but from my experience, professional experience, I can say that it's not new topic actually about reputational harm, for example, especially for heads of public institutions. I have been working for competition authority for more than 16 years. Of the last my term, I was head of competition authority, and of course we made decisions on abuse of dominant position, decisions against anti-monopolization, for example, waste management market, which is very profitable, usually, or cartels, bid rigging cases, and actually, it was not easily to make a decision. Decisions were made by board members, 5 board members. But for me, as a head of authority, I usually was like the only one responsible for the decision on, for example, when the company was sanctioned for abuse of dominant position. And very interesting was a case. 2012 or 2014, we should make decision. Decision was also drafted, and the persons who had violated competition law, abused dominant positions, they knew how the decision will be. And then there was, they started such a PR campaign against the head of the authority, saying, yes, the decision will be made in the interest of ruling political party, which minister is as supervising minister of economics for competition authority, etc., etc. And my colleague said, what is going on? Why are there 10 new different news medias opened? And everywhere is only Abrama has said that, Abrama was said other things, etc., etc. But in such cases, I usually had said to my colleagues and for me, if you made decision independent, just on taking into account legal issues, market investigation, etc., you have not to fear of that, offending. You have to be very brave and move forward. But it's very important if the authority and the head feels like independent. And afterwards, now I'm in my term as member of parliament. It's 4th year, and now I feel that some opponents or some persons who had been under investigation and who were sanctioned for cartel cases or monopolization of market abusing dominant position, yeah, they try to in social media provide about me some information, yeah, something. For example, when the taxi market was opened in Riga airport, yeah, and then they said, yes, what happens? This decision, what she has made in 2018, yeah, but decision was made by the court, yeah, but I still have to be like responsible for this decision. And then I think, yes, if I think that the head of the authority can have such power, yeah, even to in other 8 years after the decision making to influence the market and not to define the market behavior, yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, what I wanted to conclude, of course, we can speak about different cases, not just like it's here. For deliberate misuse of anti-money laundering, etc. But for law enforcement agency, it's usually very complicated afterwards when you finish your work, your job. And if you go in politics, then you have to know that usually as politician, there will be some persons who will try retaliate you for the decision what the authority has made. And therefore, I think this side event, this discussion is very important for civil society and for institutions to think about such a threat, yeah, especially reputational harm, what it can done. And you know, for me, it's not, I don't like to say, no, I was not guilty, I was not the only one the board has made. Yeah, I responsible for my decisions which have been made impartial, absolutely neutral, and usually the court, highest court has supported decisions which were made by the competition authority of Latvia, yeah, because we have still very professional staff, but for each individual it's not easy after, yeah, such work, yeah, and we have to take it into account. The law enforcement agencies, especially the heads of the authorities, can suffer later on very much, and then sometimes they are like very lonely with their problems, yeah, because you cannot go to the court and say, there has been my reputational harm. And for example, Latvian court has said politicians should have a higher level of endurance if somebody will say about you, like critics, etc., etc. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this intervention. And now, continue to reputational risk, we will discuss how it affects scientists working on critical industries, like Pavel Tanasyuk, founder and CEO of SpaceBit. Can you explain what's happened to you as a prominent voice of space industry and scientists? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and present my case, which I believe reflects the broader implications for us scientists and people who work in critical industries. So my name is Pavel Tanasyuk. I was Ukrainian born. I'm a British citizen and working on space technologies, such as rover technology for the moon. Just before the war, I promised President Zelensky that I would deliver Ukrainian flag to the lunar surface. And with the help of American partners in 2021, actually we were able to deliver it as part of the NASA Eclipse program, not to the lunar surface, but to the lunar orbit, which is still great. And I've been working on lunar technologies and rovers since then. What is interesting in my case is that I was approached by Ukrainian people saying that they want to establish certain political presence in the United States, United Kingdom, which was not really suspicious at the time, but when I started doing due diligence, I began my own review, I understood that those people are trying to basically influence certain decision-making in US, and those people have very deep Russian connection. After noticing that those people are trying to target the top political elite in the United Kingdom and United States, I decided that I have to protect democratic institutions. I basically reported to the authorities what is going on. After that, the group retaliated significantly towards me and my company. So retaliation pattern was as such, and it's very common in such situations. So I had a bad faith legal threats, strategic litigation, defamation narratives in some yellow press, pressure to intended me to be isolated from banking services and investment. Also, I received the death threats. I'm still receiving the death threats even now, and obviously it's very difficult for police to protect me. So what is really going on? It's not really about defamation. There is a much deeper problem as a weaponization of the global financing compliance architecture. So modern banking, investment, and procurement, they all depend on semi-automated risk systems. So in the case where a whistleblower or journalist or politically exposed person is flagged by the system, by the yellow press, or a hostile criminal network that is actually manufacturing reputational risk signals through the paid media or coordinated lawsuits, that can actually have a very dramatic impact and can be exploited against individuals working in strategic sectors, such as space sector in my case. So the global compliance system that was built to protect the banks, to protect the financial institution, governments or companies, actually is turned against and used by organized crime, in my case, with Russian state-connected actors. So the system can be manipulated very easily. Actually, I've seen it over the last year. And hostile actors from Russia state can affect decisions in United Kingdom, United States, and there is little transparency and little opportunity actually for people like I to fight back. So how does it actually work and what is really happening? So such operations, I would call them, by criminal networks are very difficult to counter. They do not rely on legitimate legal conduct. They often rely on lawful mechanism used as a coordinative, abusive way. So those systems, for example, that support transparency can be flooded with the sponsored defamation, or a legal system that protects the rights can be used as a lawfare. So this problem is especially dangerous, as I said, in strategic sectors, as in such sectors, everything is heavily based on trust. And if some bad actors undermine this trust, even acting from Russia or using the paid article narrative in yellow press, that can very bad influence on people, especially working in strategic problems connected to Europe, Ukraine, or United States cooperation is in my case as well. So those hostile networks can use financial and reputational tools to isolate individuals working in such sectors, and that can have effect beyond just one person. So in my case, it was not only me who was affected by a project that I was running for Ukraine, international project with UK, United States, and it takes a while for organizations to understand what is really going on. Even if for example, US authorities are working on this case, it's still kind of very, very slow. So what can be done in this case, in similar cases? So the solution is to improve and be able to distinguish between the genuine risk and coordinated retaliatory basically campaign. So this is very important, as many systems are better at detecting negative signals rather than assessing whether those signals were manufactured or real. And basically, what can we do? Well, such mechanism may involve whether we can kind of implement some systems that can see if the negative media originates from the credible source or some independent outlets which are politically motivated. There's multiple agencies that are flagging this. There are some maybe politically motivated legal processes that are happening, or whether the allegation just been used as to interfere in some strategic projects. And also, like, for example, for banks and due diligence providers, they've been abused by system widely. I've seen it in my case. And there is not really a meaningful way to fight back. There is no safeguards for people in such situation. So what can we do? Well, governments, regulators, banks maybe should consider a few reforms. First of all, we should see if it's possible to assess the quality of, for example, those signals. Where is it coming from? Is it anonymous blogs? Is it yellow press? And secondly, what is very important is to really distinguish the allegations from some countries such as Russia and with real findings. So that is very important. And basically, I believe that European organization, United States, and organizations such as OSCE should develop some rapid response channels for similar transnational financial repression cases, whereas there is a target connected to some defense technology or critical infrastructure, and the time is critical because, I mean, for me it takes a year to fight back, and it might take more, and we are losing some strategic advantages, and we are losing cooperation between many democratic countries. That is important. So, as a conclusion, I would say that my case probably should be understood as the case of a wider global security concern, where hostile actors and criminal networks, is in my case, no longer rely on violence, espionage, or bribery, but they can weaponize ordinary system of a democratic society and financial governance. Media, courts, compliance databases, all this used to silence the critics and basically stop the strategic participation between different democratic actors. This is why transnational financial repression is dangerous, and I hope that we all together can do something to fight it back and create the mechanisms. That is the most important. What the mechanisms can we create, how people in such situation, organizations in such situation can fight back and counteract those measures relatively fast. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And taking into account all of this discussion, I would like to give the floor very distinguished guests, General McMaster. You have heard actually both mechanisms, both in human aspect and also national security consequences. As a 25th of US National Security Advisor, also as a person leading Hoover Institution in the University of Stanford, we just last week met with you and we discussed all of the threats. Can you give us perspective from the point of view also US, why transnational financial repression, and in general transnational repression, is not anymore concern of activists and human rights, that it's actually national security threat and we have to fix this, especially keeping in mind what's happened with EU officials, NATO officials targeted with INTERPOL and many other tools, what explained right now. Pavlo, as a scientist on critical industry, entrepreneur in space industry, being targeted with this information. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Ludmila. It's great to be with you and to be with everybody. I think it's really important to understand that there's a very significant geopolitical, geostrategic aspect to this. Transnational financial repression is part of a much larger campaign of political subversion and what some people are calling now gray zone warfare or hybrid warfare, waged by what I would describe as an axis of aggressors centered on two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, who have pulled into the fold other actors such as Iran, North Korea, until recently Venezuela, the Cuban army regime in the Western Hemisphere, others who share their authoritarian form of government. And it's really important to note that what they're attempting to do is to tear down the existing international order, the existing rules of international discourse, and replace them with new sets of rules that are sympathetic to their authoritarian forms of government, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. They are cooperating more closely than ever. And so really what that means is we need to cooperate across our democratic countries more closely than ever to counter this sustained campaign of subversion, intimidation. These actions of transnational financial repression and other forms of intimidation, other forms of lawfare, other forms of harassment are connected to even more significant direct actions against Europe in particular. And I'm talking about the cutting of undersea cables, the drone incursions, the blowing up of warehouses, the blowing up of rail lines, assassination contracts on an executive, a senior executive of a defense firm. And so it's important to engage, to fight this kind of repression, because as we know, as we're watching football now, internationally, if you're not on the pitch, you're going to lose. And so I think it's important to understand the nature of these campaigns, what they're trying to do. Of course, they're trying to intimidate people and extinguish hope, any kind of hope in ability to counter the campaigns of these regimes, but to challenge their system of authoritarian rule. And this is essentially an effort to exert control over the life chances of those who are opposed to these regimes, expose their abuse and expose the corruption in their systems. It's important to understand, how they do this, the mechanisms they use. As we're talking about the use of INTERPOL, for example, but other financial actions. Digital surveillance is associated with this. So are direct threats, threats against relatives within those countries. But then also on the extreme side, we know that there's physical violence. We know that there have been scores of assassinations in Europe by the Iranians, for example. We all understand, obviously, the case of Navalny or the Skripal poisonings in Salisbury. So this is part of a much broader campaign. And of course, this campaign also entails the subversion of international organizations and efforts by these authoritarian regimes to turn these organizations against their very purpose. Hey, so what can we do? We've heard some great ideas already today, but I would suggest really 5 key actions. The first is expose this intimidation and repression. We have to really map it, understand the networks, understand also the degree to which organizations like the SVR and the GRU and the MSS work together in their efforts to intimidate and to turn organizations against their purpose and engage in this kind of financial repression, other forms of lawfare. The second thing is we have to educate our own populations and also the diaspora communities that are part of this campaign of intimidation. So we can organize and we can support one another, which is the third point, is supporting the victims. The type of financial reforms that are necessary when you close a bank account, having to just announce that, why are you closing a bank account, for example, and then being able to have quick legal remedies available for those who are the victims of this kind of intimidation. The fourth is we have to counter these efforts and we have to deter them. And there are some simple things we can do, like that it took us a long time to do, too long to do. It was expel all undeclared intelligence operators from hostile authoritarian regimes, and we have to go offensive. I think in a lot of these areas by mapping and disrupting these intimidation networks and going after them. With legal means across our own nations. The fifth thing is, hey, we have to reform or replicate or replace international organizations that are no longer fit for purpose. And so in Interpol, I mean, the executive committee, and we have to dominate that with democratic countries, whose systems are compatible with the initial mission of that organization. We have to form democratic caucuses within international organizations so we can advocate together. And then, hey, I think we have to expel the abusers. And if we can't expel the abusers, hey, then it might be time to form a new organization. And I know that would take a lot of work, but maybe it's something maybe of just forming an executive committee of countries that are committed to not abusing the organization and adhering to its initial mission, and excluding others from that executive committee and make that executive committee what actually functions. But it's a real honor to be with everybody. The stakes are high here. We've been complacent about this problem. I really give credit to all of you for shining the light on this problem as a first step in being able to counter this important aspect of how authoritarian regimes, how this axis of aggressors are attempting again, to rewrite the rules of international discourse in their favor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and making this happen. And now I would like to give the floor for Daniel Rothschild, Ronald Reagan Institute. Mr. Rothschild, we have heard how these tools work actually from the human side, but also as a national security threat. What about a governance and economic policy standpoint? Can you also give us information how democracies should answer to this transnational financial repression and transnational repression in general, taking into account what impact it has to our competitiveness, economies, what damage it brings to us? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here with you today. I'd like to place this question in a little bit of a larger historical context, which I feel too often goes missed. In 1987, President Ronald Reagan traveled to the Brandenburg Gate in a divided Berlin to deliver what would become one of the most celebrated speeches of his presidency. Mr. Gorbachev, he famously said, addressing the Soviet premier directly, "Open this gate." Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. 2 years later, the wall fell, or more accurately, it was torn down by the people that it was designed to keep in. And tear down this wall became the iconic call for freedom. Historian William Inboden called it the four most famous words of the Cold War. And today, the walls that the United States, the free countries of Europe, and our allies across the globe sought to tear down in the 20th century are back in a new form. Today's walls are not made of brick, concrete, barbed wire. They do not demarcate physical borders to control the physical movement of bodies. Rather, they're roving borders that serve to intimidate, terrorize, and imprison people no matter where they are in the world, including under the jurisdiction and protection of free and democratic countries. Consider the case of Natan Sharansky, one of the highest profile dissidents in the Soviet Union. In February 1986, he was freed after almost a decade in the Gulag. 3 months later, he was in the White House meeting with President Reagan in the Oval Office. This was the old calculus of dissidents escaping unfree nations for the free world. To be physically free was to be otherwise free. The power of autocrats ended at the walls that they had constructed. But in 2026, as we've seen and talked about today, this is no longer the case. Transnational repression, debanking, and harassment through the legal systems of free countries has become mainstreamed. Authoritarian and repressive regimes increasingly seek to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction over their citizens and former citizens. And in too many cases, they use financial regulations and systems set up by the West to stop terrorism to visit their own economic terrorism on dissidents. So these regulations and systems have three historical origin factors I think that are worth considering. First, as noted previously, they were largely established between about 1989 and 2001 during the height of the Pax Americana in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. They provided order in a unipolar world as the era of illicit funds were no longer being moved physically by suitcases, but instantaneously by digital networks. And second, in this global era, the important division was between state entities seeking to expand economic growth and maintain public safety, and non-state actors engaged in transnational crime, money laundering, and terrorism. And then third, as noted before, these systems were built on a foundation of trust and goodwill between state parties. It was assumed that all parties were acting in good faith and reciprocity. Further, it was assumed that all countries would mutually comply with one another's requests in a fair and equitable way. But today we are in this era that Jorge mentioned of asymmetric compliance. Europe, the United States, and our allies continue to comply with the spirit, at least, of these rules, but our adversaries do not, and they will not. International cooperation is only possible when states have a shared goal. Liberal democracies that wish to protect the economic freedom of their citizens and residents do not share the same goals as autocracies who wish to chase down and squash civil society, political opposition, whistleblowers, journalists, and academics wherever they may be in the world. Today, the international systems used to address terrorism, money laundering, and financial crimes have been hijacked to exercise a new form of the autocrat's veto. Previously, autocrats could veto the search for freedom through physically preventing departure from an unfree country, walls, exit visas, barriers to physical mobility. Today, autocrats are increasingly successful in making it impossible for dissidents and others to live free lives anywhere that they might be. People may be in a free country, but authoritarians make it increasingly impossible for them to avail themselves of this freedom. And I hasten to add, nor are autocrats restricting their appetites to current or former citizens of their own countries. Rather, they're increasingly targeting parliamentarians, judges, journalists, and academics from other countries entirely. But fortunately, as we've been discussing, these problems are solvable. The United States, Europe, and other freedom-loving countries can limit cooperation with countries that are known to abuse anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism laws, as well as those put out by their puppet regimes. More judicial oversight and actual meaningful due process, those are a first step towards creating new safeguards. Domestically, countries can move away from the vague reputational risk criteria that are often exploited by autocrats to encourage banks and other financial institutions to cut ties with, that is, to debank, individuals and civil society groups. We can expect that sophisticated disinformation campaigns by states against expatriate dissidents will only increase as artificial intelligence makes them even simpler to execute on a targeted basis. In the United States, our Supreme Court recently unanimously agreed that domestic regulators cannot coerce private entities under the guise of warnings about reputational risk. Surely we can apply the same standards to autocrats abroad. It is necessary, though not sufficient, to update policies that have inadvertently given rise to transnational financial repression. Rather, it calls on the United States, Europe, and other liberal democracies to develop a reinvigorated framework for freedom. To stand on the side of human freedom, President Reagan said, is to truly stand on the side of history. And in the previous century, standing on the side of freedom meant giving physical safety to dissidents fleeing oppression abroad. Today, that remains necessary, but it is also insufficient. Today, standing on the side of freedom also means not letting autocrats asymmetrically exploit a system based in goodwill and trust. So I commend the Parliamentary Assembly for recognizing the ways in which authoritarian regimes have deployed their systems of repression within the borders of free states and continue to do so, and for taking steps to stand against transnational repression. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this historical perspective and where we are with this situation right now. And I would like to give the floor to Marcus Wickel, one of the members of Swedish Parliament and member of Swedish Delegation to Organization for Security and Cooperation, both in Europe but also here in OSCE Parliament Assembly, who was one of also those parliamentarians supporting our voices, I think, across different platforms. Marcus, you know this issue as nobody else. Can you give us perspective? What future steps can be done from the side of legislators? Thank you.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm sorry for not being there physically present. I hope to see those of you who are at Hague right now in a few hours. But of course, thank you very much, dear friends and honorable colleagues as well, for the opportunity to actually address this important side events of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So in an era when threats to democracy do not stop at national borders, we must confront one of the most insidious weapons in the authoritarian playbook. And of course, we're talking about the weaponization of transnational repression. So especially through the systematic misuse of INTERPOL, I must say. Imagine fleeing persecution only to find that the regime you escaped can still reach you, monitoring your movements, harassing your family, freezing your assets, or issuing transnational or international arrest warrants on fabricated charges. So this is a daily reality for countless of dissidents, journalists, and activists. Transnational repression undermines the very foundations of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, security, cooperation, and the respect for human rights, of course. It turns international institutions meant to fight crime into tools of political persecution. So at the heart of this threat is the abuse of Interpol's red notices and diffusions. Designed for genuine law enforcement, these tools are increasingly hijacked by authoritarian regimes to pursue critics abroad under the guise of terrorism, treason, or economic crimes, sometimes other charges as well. Interpol's own rules forbid political abuse, yet weak oversight allows chronic offenders to exploit the system with impunity. The result is restricted travel, damaged reputations, of course, unexpected detentions, and a climate of fear that silences voices even in free societies, in the free world. So, as a member of the Swedish Parliament, a chairman of the Swedish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and of course, as a member of this OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, I've been involved with highlighting the situations in different countries, and I'm especially talking about Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, and Russia. So we see regimes repeatedly demonstrate this dangerous pattern through both the parliamentary work and in different international forums. So first, in Iran, the Islamic Republic refuses to recognize dual or renounce citizenship and openly claims authority over its diaspora worldwide. In Sweden and across Europe, Iranian authorities harass and spy on critics. Actually, just last year, there was an assassination attempt against a good friend of mine who belongs to this diaspora. And we see how the Swedish security police, SAPO, repeatedly has been flagging Iran as a top state actor in espionage and influence operations against Swedish Iranians. We have witnessed direct threats against European parliamentarians and sophisticated cyber attacks on their offices. This extraterritorial aggression is part of a broader campaign to crush the Iranian people's legitimate demands for freedom, demands that erupted powerfully after the killing of Mahsa Amini. As I've stated in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly before, but not least in PACE, in the Council of Europe, this is not a legitimate government, but a criminal syndicate that has turned a proud nation into a vast prison for millions of Iranians. And then we go to Russia and Belarus. They've turned transnational repression into a redefined arts. Russian authorities and proxies, including state-linked banks, aggressively pursue critics abroad with red notices, while combating lawfare and or combining lawfare and corporate raiding. Belarus complements this with its own ruthless tactics, extending repression across borders in close coordination with Moscow. And Cuba and Venezuela complete the picture of how these methods spread through authoritarian alliances. In Cuba, the regime intensifies domestic repression while extending its reach abroad. Despite European agreements on funding, genuine democratic transitions remained blocked. A contradiction we must address if we are serious about defending human rights. And especially here, I think a lot of European parliamentarians should step up and do more. In Venezuela, the regime has repeatedly issued Interpol's red notices and asset freezes against journalists, influencers, and opposition voices. So we see how people have been targeted simply for celebrating political shifts or speaking truth to power. Branded as traitors for exhausting or exercising basic freedoms, this fits a wider pattern of chasing exiles and critics across borders. And then we have how, or we do clearly see how these regimes don't act in isolation. They learn from one another. They sometimes cooperate and share tactics and form networks that export repression. The message to dissidents is quite clear. Know where you're safe. So to get back to this question you asked me, what must the OSCE community do? I do think that we do need to reform the Interpol with stronger independent reviews, transparency, and automatic safeguards against notices from serial abusers. particularly those involving political offenses or asylum seekers. I think that we need to bolster national defenses by improving screening of red notices and better protecting exiles and diaspora communities in different ways. I think we should hold perpetrators accountable through targeted sanctions, support for international justice, and amplified platforms for victims. And then, of course, we need to show political resolve here in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly by passing strong resolutions and turning words into coordinated action from each participating state. So the OSCE was actually born from the convention that security and human dignity are indivisible. So we cannot allow authoritarian regimes to corrupt the tools of international cooperation, because these tools are actually very important, but we need to make sure they're used in the right way. So let us stand united with the brave men and women risking everything for freedom, not least dissidents from authoritarian regimes. In Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, Russia, and far beyond. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. The eyes of the oppressed are upon us, so it's up to us and to actually do something. And I hope we can all, depending on or regardless of what different platforms we have, we need to work together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcus. And now I open the floor for questions, if we have any. Although I think we quite exhaustively explained the topic, but still, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. No? Then I pass the floor to Mauro, please.
So thank you, Ludmila. But first of all, thank you to all our appreciated speakers, because you share not only your expertise, but also your experience. And I think that today we have just learned that transnational financial repression is not an abstract concept, no? Is a reality that affects not only individual, organization, but that is a problem, a leaks also for our systems, also for democratic life. But also thank for all, Ludmila. You, as usual, have been the perfect chairwoman that everybody can desire, and congratulations for your job like president of Open Dialogue. In this, we have talked about a new phenomenon, a new issue, relatively new. In last 3, 4, 5 years, I have talked to many stakeholders, for example, bankers. And when I show this issue, often they consider this like a side effect. I think that we all underevaluate this kind of problem. You mentioned 9/11, and political system often consider this kind of threat only when there is a big issue. And politicians like to face off a challenge only when people talk about these challenges. In this case, I think we have just done an important thing. Bring these issues and put in the right place in an institution just to spread. So thank you also to the press that is present, that can help us to spread this content. And finally, we have done also a good meeting, because we record this meeting and we can ask you to spread in your country and in your channel all this information. In conclusion, today we have not questioned the value of international cooperation at all. On the contrary, we have discussed how to preserve it. because the best way to defend our common instruments is to ensure that they cannot be turned against the very values they were created to protect. So thank you everybody for helping this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everybody to join us, especially our online also speakers. Thank you so much for making this happen. Thank you. Thank you, and bye-bye for you also. General McCaslin, yes, and Lawson and Marcus. Thank you.